Listen, I've been doing this for a long time. You just got here, I got a ton of experience. This is what someone with a giant ego sounds like. If you find yourself sounding like that, that's a problem. We used to joke about this in the SEAL teams, and we even had an acronym for it, Wee Weeb or Wee Weir, when I was in Baghdad, when I was in Ramadi. If you're making reference to like tell people like, well, I have experience, you don't have an experience, we need to go with my plan. I know something, you don't know something. You need to just shut up and do things my way. And that can be a trap. Obviously, there are a lot of people out there with giant egos. We all have to work with people with giant egos, and that's a question we get often. How do I deal with someone with a giant ego?
I get to give the answer that no one wants to hear, but it is the best advice that I can give, and it's what I have done throughout my career in the military and in the business world when I run into people with big egos. And the bottom line is, when you run into someone with a big ego, what you have to do and the way that you handle it is you have to subordinate your own ego. You have to actually subordinate your own ego. And right there, when I just said that, if you're listening to this right now and you heard me say, well, if you run into someone with a big ego, what you need to do is put your own ego in check, subordinate your own ego. If that made your cackles stand up and you're like, whoa, what is he talking about? That's exactly what I'm talking about. You see, the problem isn't that other person's ego. The problem is actually your ego. And I feel this, even though I sit around and say, oh, humility is the most important thing and you got to keep your ego in check. When I run into someone with a big ego, I'll feel that start to flare up like, oh, who does this person think they are? And as soon as I feel that, I'm like, oh, there's my ego right there. And I subordinate my own ego. What does that mean? You come in and say, I've been doing this for a long time, we're going to do it my way. I feel the flare come up and I go, hey, yeah, you have been doing this for a long time. How do you think we should do it? And I actually subordinate. I'm going to listen to what you have to say. That's what I'm going to do. Now, then you'll say, well, I think we should do it like this. And I say, okay, that sounds great. Now, if I have a couple earnest questions, maybe I'll ask you some questions about the plan and why it's the best way to do it. And I hope that you have answers and I can say, okay, great. That sounds like a great plan. Let me go execute this thing. That right there. In order to be able to do that, you who's listening to this right now is like, I can't do that. That's right, because that's your ego talking. That is your ego talking. And if you truly learn to subordinate your ego and you truly learn to adopt humility, you'll be able to do this and your whole life is going to get easier. Everything that you do is going to get easier. So keep that in mind. The apex of humility comes from combat, because if you've been to combat, if you've been to true hard combat, it's not an environment that makes you feel arrogant. It actually makes you feel humble, because you realize there's things that you can't control. You realize that there are situations that you're not going to be able to handle, and it's a very humbling situation. But the rest of life is humbling as well. At least it should be. You should be put in situations where you aren't able to win. You will be in situations where you make bad decisions. You will be in situations where your decision negatively impacts you and the people around you. And you will get humbled by those situations. So life is humbling. But there are people that manage to get through various aspects of life, and they manage to get through those various aspects of life without really running into the situations where they lose. Or when they do lose, they look over at the teammate and say, that was your fault, or that was my fault, or it was the market's fault, or it was the competitor's fault, so it wasn't them. And they were able to maintain that arrogance. They're able to maintain their big ego because everything that happens that's negative is not their fault. When someone is giving you a problem, especially up the chain of command, or you run into this big ego, subordinate your ego. Now, if someone's below you in the chain of command, you start working for me, Leif, and you're a young guy and you come in here and you've got a big giant ego, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign you a project or a task that I know is a little bit outside of your capability. So I'm going to give you a project that maybe you haven't done before. Maybe it's a little bit bigger than the scope that you're used to. And what is going to happen is you're going to try and do that, and you don't have the capability, and you're going to get humbled by it. You're going to fall short. Usually one of two things happen. Number one, you come to me and you say, hey, Jocko, it's been a few days. I'm looking at this thing. I'm going to need some help. Okay. Yep. No problem. That's you coming humbly asking for help. No big deal. We got you a little bit more humble. Sometimes if you're really arrogant, you might try and hang on. And now I have to watch the project go or watch the task and say, hey, Leif, this project is due in 2 days. It looks like you're really behind. Is everything okay? And you go, well, I need some help. So of course, I'm not going to let you completely fail. I'm not going to let you ruin a project or ruin a relationship with a client by not delivering what we need to deliver. But I'll let you brush up against the guardrails of failure. I'll probably come in a little bit and ask you some questions and point out that it's not going very well and get you the help that you need. That is the best technique I've learned to deal with people that are below me in the chain of command, that have a big ego. I'm going to put them in situations that I know they can't quite handle, and they're going to get humbled by those situations. Also, everything I said in the beginning comes into play as well. So if you come to me and you say, hey, we just sold my last company that I was working at for $2 billion. Now, look, I know that you didn't have very much to do with that, but you're coming in there with that big ego. Instead of me letting my ego flare up and say, well, what part did you play in that? What were you, the third string sales guy? And you think that was it's like, no, I'm not going to say any of that. I'm going to say, hey, that's awesome. It's great that you have experience. That's one of the reasons we wanted to bring you here, because we know you have that experience of going through that whole process, and welcome aboard. And if you see anything that you think we could do better, let me know. There you go. What does that take? It takes me putting my own ego in check and saying, yeah, you know what? He might have been a third string sales guy over there, but what experience does he have? Maybe he did see some things. So when I worry about dealing with a big ego, the big ego that I focus on dealing with is my own.
That's what winning looks like. And I think people are so focused on the tactical engagement of like, well, you have a big ego and I need to tell you to put your ego in check.
Oh, how well does that work? I mean, go ahead and try that.
You need to check your ego.
Yeah. Next time someone you think they have a big ego, tell them that they've got a big ego and that they need to control their ego. See how that works out. Go ahead. Yep. Good luck with that.
It creates a giant flare up, obviously a massive antagonistic relationship. It doesn't help anybody. But that's a common response that we hear when we give that example, and people say, well, if I subordinate my ego, that's only going to just feed their ego. And it's going to make things even worse. Because they're looking for revenge. They're looking for like trying to check that person instead of, which is again, a very tactical focus, allowing your own ego to dictate your decisions instead of strategically, what does winning look like? If you have a big ego and you're my boss and you want credit for all the things that are happening on the team, like, cool, I give you credit. Awesome. Like I give you credit. I make you look good. That's my job. Is to make the boss look good, make the team look good. The more we win, the more successful we are, you're going to get credit for that. That's the nature of things, which gives me more ability to influence decisions that you're making, and so that we can actually do what we need to be successful for the team, and that helps everybody. And that's what winning looks like. Strategically, when you put that, your own ego in check, you subordinate your ego, as you said, everything gets better. And I always find that hilarious that when people say, you don't understand. You're telling me I need to be humble, but you don't understand how big of an ego my boss has. We know right away that it ain't just the boss that has a big ego. It's your own ego that's causing you the issues. Because the moment you can subordinate your ego, you can work just fine with that person. You can get along with that person, and you can have a great relationship, and you can get things done and accomplish your mission.
Yeah, subordinating your ego is a skill that you have to develop. And the younger you are and the less experienced you are with subordinating your ego, the harder it's going to be. And for me, the biggest component of subordinating your ego is the recognition that those hostile feelings that you have towards somebody is primarily generated not from them and their ego, but from you and your ego. And as soon as I recognize that, I'm able to say, oh yeah, that is my ego right there. If I want to build a relationship, if I want to not have an antagonistic relationship, if I want to be able to do a good job for the team, what I need to do is subordinate my own ego. And then what I do is listen to what they have to say. Listening to what other people have to say is the first step in subordinating your ego. Closing your mouth and opening your ears. Immediately, when you deal with somebody that's got a big ego and you listen to what they have to say, the situation improves. The situation improves. So that's the first skill, the first protocol. Number one, recognize that it's your ego. Number two, shut your mouth and listen to what they have to say.
What helps me subordinate my ego is to think about what's the end state I'm trying to achieve? What's the goal I'm trying to achieve? And if you and I are in a conflict and I can see that your ego's flaring, then rather than come at you hard and create an even worse situation, what I need to be thinking about is how can I de-escalate this? How can I de-escalate it so that we can move forward together and support each other and go accomplish the goal that we need to for our team? And that works at work. This works on the home front with your spouse or your family members, everywhere. And all it takes is the recognition of what are you actually trying to achieve? What's the outcome? What's the goal for this particular engagement? And when you can think strategically about what you want that to look like, it's not coming at somebody hard and telling them to put their ego in check. It's subordinating your ego so that you can de-escalate the situation and you can move forward in a positive direction together.
Yeah. When I get pushback on this, it's like, oh, you want me to be a brown nose? You want me to go in there and kiss their ass? No, I'm not brown nosing. I'm not kissing ass. What I'm doing is winning.